What's up, ZBrush world? Let's see, what do we got? Looks like the stream's up. Anybody is just jumping in. Just gonna give this a second to load up, make sure everybody's in. Anybody who's jumping in, just shoot me in the chat. Let me know if you can all see me, you can all hear me. Long time no see. Side effects, how's it going? Yeah, I know it's been way too long. I've been slacking on my art game lately. Been too busy with regular old Pixologic development stuff. Thanks for tuning in. Okay, looks like we got a few people loaded up. Alright, so I don't waste any time, we can get jumping in here. So today, since it's been so long, I'm taking a break from the oh gosh, what was I doing last time? ZBrush mashups. This stream I wanted to let you guys into my workflow, something I started doing. This is a project I started maybe a couple years ago, where I just wanted to go ahead and use ZBrush to make some shoes, and trying to go through to find some sort of methodology and sort of workflow centric ideas on how to properly design some of the shapes. And I found shoes are really challenging just to get the sort of silhouette and the shape and all that good stuff. You hear sound. No sound? You good? I see Mike Black Studio. Can you hear me now? What's up, Mike? Hopefully it's something else. Yeah, busy slacker. I just saw that side effects. I know. It's tough. You know, I spend a lot of time, and I'm teaching part-time too. I teach ZBrush, and then constantly, we've been, obviously since the summit last year, we've been in development, so working on a lot of stuff. And you know, it gets tough to always stay in flux with the creative phase, as you guys know. I mean, the pros, you guys probably watch a ton of the other streamers who are doing this stuff full time, and I always find I go through waves where I'll get like a good couple months where I can do a lot of creative, and then if I can't do it on a regular basis, it's hard to kind of keep a flow. So I've been in a good state the last few weeks, and so it's been nice. And this is actually something fresh. I teach this at a school here in Los Angeles. This particular sort of set of skills with ZBrush, soft goods, wearables, clothing, that kind of stuff. So I guess just to jump right into this, side effects, you said last time I watched you, you were a total noob. So you've stepped your game up. You've been watching a lot of streams and all that. Nice. You got progress. Yeah, side effects. Let's see some work, man. I don't know. Maybe you're on, if you're on ZBrush Central or whatever. So anyways, jumping into all this stuff. Oh, sorry. I'm just all ADD today. Oh, you said you still work on it for 2 weeks and then I release. Okay. So when I got started with this project, I'll just show you guys a couple images here. This is sort of a, this is one of my more recent sort of experiments, just designing a Nike Air Mag, and just focus on just basic primary shapes. But stuff that I find is really challenging is getting into more complex things like heels and shoe soles and more textured patterns and things like this. That kind of gets into like an intermediate level of ZBrush. But the foundational stuff is pretty easy, and there's a lot of the methodology I've found I want to share with you guys. Starting to get towards, hopefully we can get towards some more complex things like this today. But this whole process has been kind of a few years in the making, and me just kind of jumping in, and it's kind of turned into this whole thing. And a lot of the stuff you can find like on my ArtStation. I post a lot of these just basic renders and things like that. So the basic premise here, just kind of going back into ZBrush. When you're getting started, the first thing that I found is the most challenging is how do we get the proper orthographic views and the general shape of the shoe. Just trying to land in and hone in on that shape. And obviously, like, just basic stuff, sculpting brushes and things are usually the best thing to work in low resolution states. So something that I found very useful is, and I'm actually like, I don't know if you guys can tell if you've been checking out my old streams, is I've now upgraded in 2019 to a standing desk. So I'm going to try and stand. I might be adjusting my camera here to offset for all this, but So bear with me if I'm like changing this too much. But getting into just being able to set up a nice, quick and easy sort of orthographic setup to block this thing out. Now, for this particular example, for this shoe, I've just got a bunch of, just images I've been able to find on the web. Some orthographic, some have a little bit of perspective, so it gets a little challenging to properly line these things up. So to stay, I'm just going to jump over to Photoshop here really quick, and something I found useful was compiling the best possible selection of orthographic views of a shoe. If you're building something from, say, something that already exists, it's easier to work that way. But if you were designing from scratch, the same premise would apply, is just basically giving you a good front, side, bottom. I find the top being very useful, as you get these really nice sort of silhouettes around all this, the top portion of the shoe, to see kind of how far where things bow out and where they flex. So going into Photoshop and just using lines, just using the grid lines to basically just kind of go in and match up. Say like I've got the top view that matches up with the left and right. So the toe is touching the front. The actual, like, paying attention to the areas where the back of the heel is hitting here and here kind of helps to align these things up. So going in and just lining up these images has been the most beneficial step. So step one is getting this in. Now I will just quickly just turn off these images. So if you were designing from scratch, even just getting like a nice just black, like very simple, just silhouette, any color, just basic solid shapes and things, or if you design the stuff in Photoshop or you sketch it out, then figuring out the dimensions and those things and getting those to line up. So then going back into ZBrush, once you've got those orthographic views lined up, what I want to do is, this is going to be dealing with dealing with no perspective for a little while. And then going into the draw grid. So opening up the draw palette, I'm just going to go in, and I don't know how much you guys use ZBrushes. Personally, I don't love to do this kind of orthographic modeling, like block modeling a car or mechanical stuff. It makes more sense in those areas, but most of the time I'm kind of just free flowing. But in this case, it kind of helps to jumpstart it and save yourself a lot of time and re-sculpting, basically. But getting into using the front and back views, as well as up and down and our left and right. So number one, what I want to do is when you turn on this floor grid, we just have the default Y space axis turned on, and then going in here and turning on the X and Z. So you get the 3 grid planes. Now, if you turn off the snap option, what that's going to do is it's going to turn off the default to try and snap to the mesh or to whatever's currently in existence in the scene. So I've got a bunch of subtools turned off, so you'd see it's not, if we just go over to say this sphere, you'll see the snap locks it to the model. But within this particular tool, just because I have a ton of other stuff hidden, it's still seeing all of those things. So jumping back over here, turning off snap number 1 is going to give you that grid to lock to that sort of 3 of the 6 sides of that sort of half cube. Then going in here and taking those images that I've just compiled and going to go in and line these things up. So I guess we could start with since I'm going to be working from the side view, we could start with the left and right, going into your map, quickly just going into my, grab my, I believe I have this in a folder here. Yes, ortho lined up, so we got the left and right side. So because I line these things up, a really, I guess, quick thing to point out is because the grid is square. So if you're going to do this in Photoshop, or if you want to use this sort of technique, basically making sure that your image, your file image, when you're exporting out these individual JPEGs, are square. So if they're square and everything's lined up within that space, when you load this thing in, the image is going to snap perfectly to this grid without any need for adjustments. Now, if you aren't doing, say you want to kind of free flow and you don't go into Photoshop and line these things up, you can, within these menus, you do have the option to say go in to change scale. You can do horizontal offset, vertical offset, and just kind of like reposition these things as you go. But I find that this can be a little challenging to line these things up. Basically, if you go in here and we can go and turn on our close left and right. We can do with our modifiers, we can basically go in and change different levels of fill mode and be able to, say, project this on the mesh and play around with some of these settings. But ideally, it's best to just have a simple reference, so you don't have to go through and play around with too much of this stuff. So going back into, so basically just loading up these images left and right. You'll see if we rotate around on the other side, you're basically just getting a perfect mirror. Now with this, when you're dealing with shoes, especially, I'm kind of making this a little difficult on myself to this is a little bit more of a complex sort of shape, but let's just bring up, say, this sort of shoe. So the outer side of the heel is different than the inner portion. So you could go in and load a secondary map if you can get a reference image of the same of the inside angle of that area. But I think I'll be able to kind of work this out in ZBrush and won't have to spend too much time compiling too much reference. So just loading these images to each of the floor grid planes. So I'm just going to go in and just open a quick grid that I've already made. So my photo match grid. So now you'll see here, I've got the tops of the shoes are lining up here. The toes, most importantly, the back heel and the front heel are lining up from the top and the side view, which I found is the most crucial part to get this sort of general shape going. Now you'll see the front, this is a little challenging because when you're dealing with photos, for example, it's got some perspective to it, so it doesn't necessarily line up perfectly. So it's like you almost can only use about this much of it as reference. Everything down here, it's going to start to distort the mesh as we start working. So what I tend to do is focus on the side and the top views, and then just use this to kind of reshape and kind of go along. Now, going into let's see what else. We could just leave this as is. I do have another set of photo grids where I load a separate one maybe in the back to give me some extra reference, but we'll get there. So just kind of getting started now while you've got the draw grid lined up. The fill mode plays a part, so if you want to choose, like if you want this to have perfect fill, it's going to make the model transparent. If you go in and let's say we set this to 2 and we can go into our modifiers, you'll see that at level 2 the enhance factors are grayed out. If we crank this thing up to 3, then you get these enhance factors where you can choose how much you want that model to sort of have edge transparency. For me, I like to see the general sort of three-dimensional silhouette instead of just seeing edges. Otherwise, the mesh gets a little wonky. And the goal here is to not get that lumpy sculpt. You want to have a nice, clean form to build on, and this is what I found is the most important thing while you're working. So that pretty much means working at a low resolution state. So when I get started with these things, and I find this is applicable for all kinds of shapes and things that may not necessarily be a shoe. It could be just general organic shapes as a whole. Basically just using move brush, and this is just basic sort of ZBrush old school techniques, just big draw size, large scale movements. Try not to get into the nitty gritty of like moving little bits here where you start to get lumpiness. You want to go like big broad strokes. So even in this case, you could go in and double click dynamic to get a wider range of the draw stroke, or you could go in with dynamic on, and the max right now is at 1,000, but you can go into the draw palette and you can change the max brush size. For me, I like to keep it at 1,000. I like the brush reaction at this size. I find a little bit of a difference between it. So that's just me. So then just quickly to kind of go through it, so we're just going to kind of go through and start mashing this in. So just playing around with this general sphere, and this is just a basic polysphere that I've started with. And what I find is the most sort of the range of resolution is going into Dynamesh and getting into somewhere around, for the entire shell, somewhere around 50,000 to 60,000. And I'll get into why that's important, but eventually this deals a lot with panel loops and group loops features to create these sort of shells of geometry, which means that the effectiveness of those automatic tools work a lot better, I find, at lower states. When you get into higher resolutions, the extrusions and everything takes a little bit longer. It's harder to polish out. So going into Dynamesh and just remeshing this at 128 actually is pretty good. We'll say 48,000 we'll say is probably enough. While you're shaping, even going lower, like sort of work your way up to that level. So maybe go down to say like maybe 20 or so thousand. We can kind of start to sort of move this stuff around. So I'm just going to kind of go through and just hit the general silhouette. So all I really care about while I'm doing this stuff is just trying to hit all the way to the tops, all around the edges, including the heel here. Yeah, see, I'm already falling into bad habits. Sitting back down, I got to use this standing desk. this. Once I kind of get this roughly into that range there. Now, quick things, you know, I use for the floor grid. I'm using a custom UI, so if you guys do have questions about some of this stuff, I'll do my best to mention where I'm pulling these things from. But the hotkey, just turning off the floor grid, sometimes I like to just turn this off, which is Shift P. So just toggling that thing off. So then now you'll see like that side view, it's great for the silhouette on the side, but now I got to go through and I got to reshape. So then this is where I find that top view is crucial. Now I was just using symmetry for that, and in this case, it's almost better to just right off the bat go no symmetry. You're not going to be dealing with a whole lot of symmetry in a scenario like this. So I'm working on the left shoe or the left foot. And then let's go over to our front view and maybe start to hit that. So this is giving me a good idea of the silhouette of just like the boot wrapping around the ankle. But everything going down towards the toes, that's going to get a little hairy. So I'm basically just forgetting all about this. Alright, and now let's just go to our backside. So now the backside, this is where maybe just going in, turning this off, and I'm just going to kind of, you could even pull up just a basic reference where you don't have to get, I try not to get too married to ortho. Use your sculpting modeling skills, train your eye to start to look for those silhouettes, and like I always keep the outline shader here within my just basic selection of materials that I like, because that's just giving me an idea of just general overall sort of silhouette and curvature. And for the shoes, you know, like I've got a couple examples, like, you know, some other more complex things like a Nike running shoe. It's got some really just basic sort of like contour and shape, gets a little hairy. And so at this stage, this is what I find is the most important, is landing this part down first more than anything else tends to do a lot more once you get towards the end of the detailing process. So then kind of just eyeballing this, like I know it kind of tapers back here. And now something I like to do is, since I'm kind of like getting into the sort of messiness of this, let's go back to the bottom here and let's just do maybe a mask. Skip this note. So I'm just grabbing the mask lasso. Another thing that I like to do with my custom UIs is I put my mask and selection brushes down here. So instead of having to hold control, go over, select a new one, hold control shift, blah blah blah, you're kind of going back up and down to hitting keys, I can actually select, I just put these as custom brushes here. So when this works where if you select the between a masking brush and a selection brush, you do have to accept this skipped until restart basically. But now I can toggle back and forth and that's automatically gonna select that brush at that time. So even just going in and just grabbing a chunk here, maybe go in and just kind of like extrude this down, maybe grab a clip curve, you know, kind of just go through and remesh. So then, and even at this stage, like if you, Dynamesh works pretty well, but I'm going to go down and reduce this resolution quite a bit. And since I'm using Spotlight, I'm going to make sure I turn off my Spotlight projection so I can sculpt while working on this mesh. Then going back to my floor grid, and at some point, so big draw size, I can kind of go back and just reshape. So you see I just basically just pulled all that down, and then now it's just basically giving me a more realistic sort of flat portion of this heel. So spending a little bit of time just kind of going through, getting this stuff roughly into place, and then going back to the top. Now I can sort of readjust and continue to work this shape overall. And the sort of bottom of the shoe, I tend to find doing this from the bottom orthographic with the big draw size can help a lot. When you run into like, I'm trying to pull this out, but I don't want to hit this, you know, we could go in and say just use selection brushes to hide a portion. I'll turn on double-sided so I can see it. So you could use something like this sort of technique to kind of go through and reshape it. So keeping this thing super low, and I don't want to spend too much time because it could take a good 20-30 minutes to kind of go through and sort of hash this out. All right, going through, checking that orthographic, lining this things up. So all these extra parts I'm trying to avoid, but I really want to make sure I land home like some of these things, these areas here. And this is one of the benefits I like, where at these low states, just with a big draw size and holding the smooth brush can help to just ease the transition a lot faster. If you're up into the hundreds of thousands or more, smoothing stuff out gets a little hairy, and then you start getting these lumpy sort of shapes and these weird sort of contours. So just like keeping this as low as possible, I find to just be a much more enjoyable experience as well, to kind of get what you want. Alright, so once I got these things lined up, now the mesh is going to change here in a second, because we're going to have to go through and we're going to start to sort of hollow out the boot and get the shape going a little bit further, and then we'll be able to refine again. So kind of continuing to work this, and let me just check the chat real quick. Hi from Bangladesh. Hey, thanks for tuning in. What time is it in Bangladesh now? I guess you're maybe 8-10 hours ahead. Hannibal X, hello. How did you create the weave effect on the last sneaker? I'm working on the leather outfit, and this has a weave pattern wrapped by a leather lace. Okay, so the weave pattern, there's a couple things I'm going to get to that here in a second. Like we're going to try and get to like a sort of final sort of shape here, where you can find, like, I'm going to get to like the creation of this, but just going into the noise maker, you'll see I've got a weave pattern turned in here. Now this is an alpha that I've been hanging on to this one for years. Let me see if I can pull this up. Open a new window. So I've got a couple tiled weave patterns, which you can find some of these things. Like if you can get a tileable pattern, you can either make this in Photoshop, you can make these things in ZBrush, which I can recommend if you want to do sort of tileable patterns. Let's see, ZBrush. If you go into the download center, Joseph Dress has made a pretty awesome plugin that helps you to make tileable patterns. So let's take a look. This does ship with, do they have this listed in here? No. Well, you can go into ZBrush Z plugin, and it is the oh, interesting. Oh, is that the C? See if I can pull this up for you. Nanotiles is what I'm looking for. I could not think of the name for the life of me. So Nanotiles plugin. This is actually a plugin that we may have to. It's still further. Here we go. I just didn't scroll down. Duh. Okay, so Nanotiles textures. You can download this plugin, which it'll just give you a straight zip with instructions. And if you go into Nanotiles ZBrush Central, Joseph has made a full ZBC thread that's focused on applications of this, ways of making tileable patterns. Now this gets into a little bit more. This might not be the best way for weave, but it's good things. It's good for other more complex types of tiling. If you can achieve that in Photoshop, you can go to places like textures.com to get tiled patterns. But weave in itself, like this is just using these basic sort of alphas. So I've got a couple other ones, like this is the one I'm using. So a more sort of finely controlled weave pattern, so a little bit smaller. And this has sort of got these sort of chevron arrow type shapes. But something you can try, which I'll try and get to here towards the end, is going into the noise plugin. We could take a look at just the weave. And this plugin itself, if we go and turn our mix off, change the plugin scale down a lot further, and then increase that strength, we can now go in here and start to shrink this down quite a bit. So you can push this in the positive or the negative. So if we do positive strength, it's going to bump this stuff out. And let's just find a good sort of scale factor here. Now, when you're dealing with certain objects with UVs, especially this option here, this ratio, this is going to control the sort of intensity of that weave. So once you've got a good sort of scale factor, the noise plugin, if you go into edit, there's a lot of parameters here that we can change. For example, you could start with the pattern. You could change it to herringbone, which is going to give you that sort of chevron overlaced effect. You can also change the width of these weave patterns. You can change the width of the vertical and horizontal portions. So you can start to modify and tweak these things, and even go in and change the level of sort of shading effects on those particular extrusions that are coming in. So this is the Noisemaker plugin is a pretty awesome feature. However, I will say this to get to this state, like I just clicked it and turned it on. But in reality, this is using UVs, which I've sort of set this up to show you guys. The default setup is using a 3D projection, which is going to give you just picture a giant capture sphere just projecting this on. It doesn't really have any orientation, and it's not able to map it on the surface as well. So making UVs, changing this from 3D to UV is crucial, which I'm going to get to that. So at least hopefully that gives you a glance at it, which is what I want to try and get to here in a second. But so if you have other questions on that, make sure to let me know and I'll check that. You said the cross stitching that was on the last sneaker. Oh, the cross stitching, you're talking about this. Like this stuff here, so this is actually getting into making, this is a decimated version, but essentially what I did is I made an insert curve brush and actually used it to draw on the surface. So if you go into like any of these IMM curve brushes, for example, let's go like something like this, and just grab like any one of these sort of stitches or this sort of vine here. So it's basically just a curve brush that by default is basically just it's made up of a start and end point, and you've just got a repeating part. So essentially, let me see if I can, I wonder if I have that. That was the Nike running shoe. Let's see, maybe I keep that in my 3D brushes. Nope, not that. Okay, well I guess let's maybe we could just do that real quick. Let's go. I'm just gonna grab a plane here really quick. And I believe what I did here was if you go to brush and let's just click C for curve, we can use the curve tube snap. So the curve tube snap makes a really nice sort of clean tube. Now imagine trying to do that stitching for that type of shoe. It's going to take a lot of finessing and making it all perfect. So what I think I did is I tried to find the sort of repeatable, like a tileable part here. So I went in here and I think it's like something along the lines of grabbing here to here. So just grab this tube and let's click to get rid of that curve. Go to subtool, split, unmasked. So we can grab this thing. Now this is going to require us to do a tiling of the object, and actually we might not even need all of this. If we go to, let's just solo this guy out. So I'm just adding a subdivision here, and let's go geo, delete lower. Now what I want to do is I want to grab I want to be able to get a repeatable edge that's going to be able to connect. So something like, I think we don't need this. Let's group that thing off. So we can even go in here and let's do Subtool, split hidden. Now we could go in here and just grab, so I'm using selection brushes to just grab an edge, and I'm growing this out with the visibility. So visibility, grow, you can either use the grow or the grow all, but the hotkey for grow is Control-Shift-X. So as long as you grab a clean edge, a perfectly clean edge, which this tube gives you when you draw this thing out, I'm looking for a flat sort of vertex edge here. So when this point, basically I'm going to want this to be able to connect along a curved brush. So just grabbing a chunk here, and let's just go Geo, Modify Topo, Delete Hidden. So I've got this thing. We can turn off this floor grid as well. And let's crank up the floor. Now let's go in, and I'm just going to grab, turning on Gizmo. So I want to be able to do just a quick mirror and weld, but to make this work, let's go in here, and I just want to grab this edge. So if you don't know, with the selection lasso, holding Control-Shift, grabbing selection lasso, if you've got a perfectly clean connected edge loop, if you click on the edge between one point and another along that loop, you can isolate that thing out. So I can grab this, and what I want to do is just go in and mask off. Or even, because we don't have any subdivisions on this mesh, we could go to Brush, ZModeler Brush. Oops. So we got ZModeler, and what I want to do is I'm going to go to the edge action, and we can do mask edge loop. So we can mask this whole thing, and then inverse this. So I just want to bring this down a little bit. And then to go a little bit further, going over here, let's just grab this thing. I'm going to flatten this out. So this should make sense here in a second of what I'm doing, but I'm going to go in with ZModeler, do a slide edge loop just to kind of taper this here. Now with the floor grid, I've got this thing lined up just below the x-axis. So if we go into Geo, Modify Topo, Mirror and Weld, instead of X, let's do Y, and let's click yes. Now I'm going to get a nice clean edge. So maybe what I'll do is, let's just bring this thing up a little bit, and I might go in and just pull this down a little bit further. So I'm going to give it a little bit more of a sort of arc, and then mirror and weld. Let's do always yes. There we go. So now this seam here is lining up perfectly. And then let's go in here, and we just need to do this for this top group as well. So going into Brush, ZModeler, let's go Mask, Edge Loop, grab this one, and just use the gizmo to pull this up, and then I might just slide these edges. Now it's important for this to be perfectly flat, so I'm just masking enough and using the gizmo to scale it. You could also, a more easy way to do it would be using the clip curve brush to just go in and flatten that top edge. Now if we go in and let's just do that mirror and weld again, mirror and weld in Y. This is getting a little bit better, so now I might just go in here and let's just go deformation, maybe just polish it, like say 2. Oh, see, that's gonna, let's just cap off, mask off the edges. Alright, and so you're basically just going to make a tileable part that's going to start to connect. So as you draw this thing along a brush, it's going to go through and connect those pieces for you. So I might have done like a start, like a finish line here, but let's see if we can make this work. So we go, make this a brush, go to brush, create insert mesh, make new, and then let's go to stroke, curve, and turn on the curve mode. So when you draw this thing out, now what it's doing is it's drawing this along the curve. So to make this work, if you wanted to draw along the curve, like based on this orientation, if you do it vertical, that's the way to go. If you were to rotate this way and do brush, create insert mesh new, and go to stroke and turn on that curve mode, when you draw it out now, it's turned the other way. So the orientation is important. Then all you need to do is just look at the camera, perfect orthographic front. So we could do it again, make it insert mesh, let's go stroke, whoops, insert mesh new, stroke, and turn on that curve. So now that thing's going, and then basically just going into the stroke and the curve stepping, let's make this like 1.2. So now this should it's going to increase that step. Let's go to maybe stroke 1.1. So draw size changes it. And maybe it needs to be just a little bit more. And then the last thing would be going into the brush modifiers and turning on this weld points. So weld points, you'll see once that's on, you'll see that these disconnected edges are now snapping. And this works really, it works best when you go in and, like, I'll go back to the model here in a second. Let's just make that a little bit bigger. So I'm changing my draw size and clicking on it will update it. So now it's snapping those edges with that brush modifier weld point setting. And the only reason that that works is because I actually went in and I made sure that the doing this mirror and weld, so number one, flattening those edges at the top, these are matching on the top and bottom, so they're exactly the same position, the same number of verts, because I did this mirror and weld. So then once you've got that set up, we could basically now go in and on any particular mesh, now that it's a curved brush, going into the stroke and making sure that the snap setting is on. And then if you just go in, let's just grab a sphere, make polymesh. If we draw this along the contour of an object, it's now snapping to that surface. So that's pretty much the gist of it. And then the only thing is, I didn't close off the caps for that. The caps are, you see, they're incomplete. So something that I do, like if you have an open end like this, we could click it to delete the curve and do subtool split unmasked, and then we could take this, so we got these open faces, and we could just go into Geo and just do a quick close holes. And once you're done, a really awesome thing is Z-remesher. If I just go through and Z-remesh this thing after it's been applied, it's going to remesh this thing into quads. And then you could go in and add some subdivisions, smooth that thing out, or maybe just go in and do a little, if you want to do some polishing to kind of soften up those edges. So the curve brushes are super beneficial for all kinds of stuff like this. For this particular project, like, I used it a ton. I actually used it to do sort of like the sort of diamond patterns along the heel, and it gets very helpful in these areas. So hopefully that wasn't too long-winded, but hopefully that answers your question. I got to check the chat real quick. Okay, so you were saying what I had to do is, I suppose, stitch leather. Stitched leather straps. Yeah, so like the construction of the thing plays a big part. But yeah, so Brian Stokes said, awesome, so much good stuff. Oh yeah, thanks Brian, I appreciate it. I'm glad you're loving all this. Is it Ire? I'm sorry, you're from Ireland. Tuning in from Ireland. That's awesome. You're my first Ireland streamer that I'm aware of, at least. Hey, from Pakistan. Hello. Cool. Yeah. So going back to the boot shaping here. Let's see. Where did we leave off? All right, so I was working on this sort of just general shaping of the boot. Now, just to kind of jump ahead here, so once you get this stuff going, we're going to end up with something along the lines of this. Now, you'll see that the bottom, the heel here, I've kind of gone in and I've flattened. So something that you'll see the resolution is about what I was mentioning earlier, around 40, 50, 60,000. This might be a little high, but was something I made sure of. We could just do this. Let's just polish this a little bit. So I use this deformation polish a lot. But even just going with the mask lasso, grabbing a chunk here, blurring this thing a ton, and just pulling this down a lot. So pulling it even beyond the reference image, and then simply just going in with the clip curve. So holding Control Shift. As we draw this thing out, if we just tap Alt, we can create a curved point. And we can just kind of go in here and we can flatten out that shape. So just to get it in the ballpark, to make it a little bit flatter, and then go in, we can either polish this thing or re-dynamesh it. So and then maybe just do a little polish. So that's kind of crucial. Like if it's not a flat bottom, like if it tapers a little bit, like even if you look at this image here, you see it is a little rounded. So something you can do is even just kind of just lightly going with a smooth brush might do the trick. Using the polish helps to soften that transition, and then re-dynameshing that thing will help as well. So now I've I've got a decent sort of silhouette here, but it's really difficult to hit the reference I find for the sort of shells where because we have a hollowed out shoe. So if you look at sort of the top, we got to start to get the thickness of these parts and things, and the only way to do that is to get that shell going first. So the shelling process I'll show you really quick is essentially a two-step process. Primarily, we are going to use Dynamesh for this, but the first thing that we want to do is we want to hollow out the inside of the mesh. So an easy way to do this with Dynamesh is in the Dynamesh menu, we've got the Create Shell feature. Now this requires an operation, so you actually have to add an insert mesh to this to activate it. So easiest way to do it is clicking on the brush palette, going into your insert brushes, and then you can just grab the IMM primitives brush. IMM primitives. And then I have you guys should see if we go to interface, IMM viewer, auto show and hide. You guys should see it either on the side or the top. All we need is just an insert sphere and in any object basically. So we want to subtract and create an inner shell. So this requires us to do the negative operation. So holding the Alt key and just dragging the sphere anywhere on the mesh is fine, and it's gonna mask the boot and then leave the insert mesh unmasked, but it's inside of the mesh, or it's basically invisible at this point. So if we turn on the gizmo, we could just pull this thing out. So you'll see that this thing is unmasked. So this is the first operation, holding Alt, drawing this thing. This is going to help us to activate this. So if we clear the mask, and instead of re-dynameshing this thing, we want to actually click the create shell instead. So not holding Control and dragging, but actually going in and clicking this button. And then first thing you want to check is the thickness of this. So the relationship of this number isn't in any sort of definition of scale or millimeters or inches or anything like that, but it's a sort of variable number. So we could go ahead and just click. Maybe I'll bump this up to 8. So I want it to be, or maybe let's do, say 10, and let's click Create Shell. So what it does is it goes through and that operation activates it. And if we go in with the selection brushes, let's just grab I'm going to turn off this IMM viewer, grab the selection rectangle and just grab a chunk of it. With display properties double on, it's created that sort of inner shell. So it hasn't closed off. We still have a closed cap on the top, which we'll get to in a second. But at this stage, I just kind of want to go in here and kind of eyeball how thick do I want that inner portion of the boot to be. So if you look at the top, if I'm just kind of comparing these two, might be a little bit better if we just hide the top portion. We can take a look. So maybe that was just a little bit too much. So I can undo back to, I've got the sphere here. And then let's go back to the thickness, and let's just take this down to maybe 6. So clear the mask and then create shell. And then let's go in here. And I'd say that's pretty good. We can work it if we need to, but essentially all we're trying to do here is get the hollowed out portion on the inside. So then once we got that going, let's go over here, get this thing working. Now we need to go in and actually do the Boolean operation to hollow out this particular area at the top, and we've got the part of the toe as well. So this is something we can easily do with live Booleans. You could do this with Dynamesh as well. So let's go in here and just say the sort of general shape here, I would say we could use a cylinder. So inserting a primitive cylinder. And I'm just going to go and kind of roughly line this thing up and ballpark it. Now what I might do here is, since it's going to be a Boolean operation, I might go in, let's just divide this to smooth it out. Little trick I like to do, I'm going to Dynamesh this thing in a second, but adding a couple subdivisions helps to smooth out the surface, and then we can go in and Dynamesh that guy. Let's do deformation, maybe polish this thing out. So then now what I might want to do is maybe just grab a chunk of this, tuck this thing out. So I'm sort of creating that sort of pill shape in there. And then let's see what's next. Now what we want to do is we want to we can maybe do a two-step process here. So we could set up the Boolean tree where I've turned off everything else. I've just got the main boot and this sort of pill shape. We can set this to subtract, And let's go in here and we can go into render booleans. We could turn on a live boolean, which I have down here in my custom menu. So once that is on, you guys should see it up here. Once it's on, I could go back to my pill shape and we could kind of just go in and start sort of flexing this. Alright. And then let's see, the next step would be, we might even want to go in here. We could re-dynamesh this number 1 so I got a cleaner surface for masking. So I'm just blurring this transition a little bit. And I might go in here and just start to, say, squeeze this in. And another thing that you can do is, while this thing is set up, is we could actually just go in and start just shaping it the way that we want to. So maybe even going in and grabbing a good front ortho to kind of see what's going on here. So it's kind of going a little bit wider at the top and then tapering in. So big draw size maybe. And you could turn on the polyframe if you need to see that mesh overall. And then now let's see here, what do I want to do? I want to grab just this chunk here. Let's pull this all the way down. And then we could go in and just, it's basically just making this super basic here and just go in and pull this thing out. Could even go in and, if I wanted to, just grab this chunk here, delete hidden, and re-dynamesh it. Alright, so this doesn't have to be you know, a whole big thing. Like, it's, we could easily clean this up with Dynamesh. Just trying to get the rough sort of shape going in here. And maybe even reduce this resolution so I can smooth it out a lot better. Yeah, that's better. Alright, so because we've already done this sort of hollowing out of the inside, all we need to do is subtract all of this stuff. So then the last little bit, like, we can maybe try and taper this edge a little bit further, but I would say this is probably good enough to work with. So what I'm going to do now is, because we're using that live boolean, I'm going to go into subtool and let's do boolean, and let's do make boolean mesh. So it's going to go in and just generate that U-mesh shape, which now we're going to do a little bit of cleanup. So taking this guy, going into, say, Dynamesh again, and we could start off by just kind of going in, smoothing this stuff out. Like, I don't want to have this whole lip in here, so I might just go through and smooth a ton of this out. And maybe even to make this quicker, go down resolution. Alright, so then now going back to my floor grid, I'm going to start to rework the sort of angle of all these edges. So I want to, this is, now that I've got the shapes a little bit more accurate to what I'm going for, now it's really about trying to land home the contour of all these particular areas. So making sure I'm checking both sides. I know that this boot's gonna, you can see like just the edge of this one, I'm just using the lip to kind of line these things up. And then now let's go ahead and check the top view. Now this is where this particular portion I might need to work on one side without affecting too much of the others. So going in even with the masking and just cutting this thing in half maybe. And what I tend to do is I almost always will soften out this transition while I'm using the move brush, which is a little bit easier with the mouse. So then with that top view, now I'm going to go in and just maybe push this over. And then inverse that, push this one. just keep kind of readjusting. All right, so then let's go back. Let's turn this thing off. So then this would be the general process that I'm going through just to kind of land in this primary sort of shape. So I would spend a little bit more time, like you see, like the edges aren't quite lined up. But just to save some time here, let's go back. We can delete this guy. Or actually, I'm going to need to. So I'm going to go back into my scene here so I can work on this. Within this one, so we got UMesh. So I'm going to insert this guy. Let me check this chat real quick. Yeah, ZBrush is a wonderful program, huh? Ghost of Christmas Future. That's a great username, by the way. Cool, man. I'm glad this is up your alley. Hopefully this will give you some ideas. This is something I spent a lot of time on, and I'm finding more uses for these tools, especially what I'm going to start getting into here in a second. So I just brought this other this new mesh back into my scene, and I'm still working on the general shape. I don't want to spend too much time finessing, but let's kind of get this in the ballpark here. So quick things you can do, you see the left side's just a little bit more puffy, which I want. So I can go in with the inflate brush at a low intensity, and this is where that low resolution state really helps a ton. And I might even go down. See, I'm at 106,000. I'm kind of breaking my own rule. So I want to get up to, like, you know, get back down to around 40 or 50. So then maybe going with the inflate brush just really lightly, kind of going in and puffing this back out. It's just a little too low res. Gotta find a good sort of happy medium here. Alright, now the next one is going to be, we got to do one more quick sort of reshaping of this. So the back view is a pretty good one to kind of give you an idea of where this shape is kind of hitting. I want to get that right sort of contour. Alright, now the next one, if you take a look at the images, this has got a pretty unique sort of shape, sort of horseshoe sort of loop cutting in here, which this one I found, let's just turn off this poly floor grid real quick. Let's go up to around 75, 80. Just changing my Dynamesh resolution. Now for this one, like you see, I'm kind of flexibly going up and down. Really, I'm only, depending on the operation that I need to do, I might need some more resolution here, which going up a little bit higher to get rid of this area, which we could use even just the selection lasso. Let's try and go in here and clip out this chunk. Let's go floor grid. So with the double-sided on, you'll see that we're cutting out this chunk, which we'll see how this works. But I'm going to go through and let's go in and just say delete. Let's do modify topo, delete hidden. So if the Dynamesh resolution is high enough, if we re-Dynamesh this, it's going to try and close it. So you see it kind of got rid of it, but some of these areas where you've got overlap, we've got one large sort of gap, it can't completely close this thing off all the way through. So we can use Dynamesh to the best of our ability. That's pretty good. but then I might just go in here and just kind of rework this by hand. So turning off the, and you could even go in and do something like this too. This is like just basic like Boolean sort of shaping. Let's just go into like subtool, insert, grab like a cylinder, maybe subdivide this thing up, rotate this thing 90 degrees. This could maybe help alleviate the sort of a lot of time you might spend like hand working something. So as long as that's cutting all the way through, we could again go back, set this thing to subtract, and then maybe even go back to that source mesh and push this thing down so it's matching up. And then make that Boolean mesh. Let's go insert, bring that new one in. So that new one, now it does that little Boolean operation, but you know, we can always just keep bouncing back to our Dynamesh. So maybe I'll go up to like 200 on this just to get a nice remesh of all this, and now do a quick little polish or smooth, just to keep this nice and clean. So then some last little sort of finessing of all these parts. And I might be a little bit more obsessive about this stuff as you guys like. I get really honed in on trying to make sure that this is lining up correctly before I get too far ahead of myself. Let's go turn this thing off. Okay. Cool. Just about there. So then, now that we kind of got the primary shapes, let me make sure I got everything in here. So I cut everything out. I got the this little loop here. Now moving on to the sort of additional parts and pieces. This is where we're going to start. Where I find the panel loop stuff is really awesome. Starting to get into the shapes of the heel and the sort of the panels in the shoe itself. So if you really look at this closely, if we maybe look at this guy, right, we've got some sort of extruded loops. This thing's a little bit puffier. There's a sort of a boot group or a panel here on sort of an extrusion rather where that weave pattern's going. So to start hitting those things, we're going to get into the group loops and panel loops. So the first thing you want to do, so we got this sort of thing lined up, and what I'm trying to get to here is the sort of complete sort of final, if we go back to the final boot, let's just take a look at the shoe here. And I'll just turn off the color for a second. So you can see that, you know, we got some simple sort of extrusions and some beveled edges and all these kinds of things. So everything that I'm going to go into now, this is the sort of process to get to this little this level of extrusion and cleanliness to start to clean up all these final components here. So then going back to, so here's like a more low res state where this thing's a little here. I haven't applied that texture yet, but all this process is going to deal heavily with number one, assigning the right kinds of masks to the shape. So let's go back to the original source mesh. Now going back to that ortho, what I want to do is I want to start to outline the general parts that are going to be extruded or separate with masking. And so we're going to use masking to assign polygroups. So, and if you remember, I mentioned that the outer part of the shoe, the edges are different here than they are on the inside. So I'm going to have to work that out. But what I find is best is looking at it on the inside of the floor grid. If you go to the other side, you got the sort of polyline view. So it's a little bit faded. So going from this angle is a good place to start, and the resolution will play a part. Like I've cranked this thing up pretty high, around 600 and some thousand. This is going to be good to get a nice clean mask on the surface. So if I were like down, I don't know, say we take this thing down to 100, we can see how this is going to work out. So we jump that thing down a little bit further. And let's just see if we can maybe compare. So then turning on that floor grid, I'm just going to use the mask lasso here to just go in and lasso out the edge of this heel. Alright, so the mask lasso is great because it travels through the mesh, so it's applying that on both sides, as opposed to, you know, if I were to go in with the mask pen, drawing on a side, you're not getting that on both, and we don't have a symmetrical object, so that's not going to work anyways. Now at this point, the mask quality, you'll see, like, to kind of go in here and refine these edges isn't the most sort of efficient, and it's not as I can't get as precise as I'd like to. So this is where, going back to that 600,000 level, let's just undo. This might be a little bit better in this portion of it. So then doing this one more time. Alright, so let's turn off that polyframe. Now, going to this side here, I do want to do a little bit of cleanup, so I might switch back to the mask pen here. And a little handy trick if you want to sort of clean up these edges and things is we can even turn off the floor grid now and just polish this up by hand. Holding the control key, so we got the mask pen in this case, going into the stroke and turning on the lazy mouse. So lazy mouse with a high radius, you get a nice cleaner sort of application of it. So I could use this to either, I might do a control alt click to sharpen, kind of go in here and just roughly clean up this edge. Alright, now I'm going to take a look at that, see if I can grab a nice reference with that inner heel. This guy looks pretty good. Yeah, so like this does a little double swoop. This one kind of goes up and over. So it looks like it's kind of taking this one, it's just skipping over this part. So I can maybe just go in and just roughly eyeball this. You fill that in, and let's just clear this guy out. So I put my lazy mouse settings here, so when I hold control, I don't have to go to stroke, I can just turn it off here. And so just modifying that a little bit. Now, what I tend to do here is like, this is where you'll see when I turn on polyframes, I got just a messy selection of polygroups or randomly assigned all over. I'm going to start to clean these things up. So with this mask assigned, what I'm going to do is press Control W, which is going to group the masked area. So now we got a mask selection. Anytime if I want to grab that mask for the heel, I can do that. And then I could actually go in, let's just grab this, reverse everything else, and let's do Control W for that. So I got just two primary groups. So I can use this as a way to easily reselect that mask if I want to, and sharpen it if I need to as well. Now, this will get into the panel loop stuff here in a second, but because the heel is a separate component, think of it as like if you were making this thing in real life, you'd have a piece of rubber that you're basically gluing on or somehow adhering it to the inner frame here. So for something like this would be the only thing that we won't use the group loops and panel loops features for, but just going into Subtool and doing a simple extraction. So going into the thickness, the default setup at 0.02, let's just see what this gives us. So kind of looking at the top view, that thickness is, I'd say like 1/4 inch or so. So kind of maybe even just going into the 3/4, clicking extract to show the preview. That's probably okay. So I'm going to click accept. Oops, and the only problem here is that the original mesh, because it's got the inner, that sort of inner group, so if we just grab this guy with that double-sided on, you'll see that we got this inner polygroup here. So it's basically that mask is transferring through. So if you don't want that to happen, you could just do, I do this a lot, where as long as these edges aren't touching, we could do that polygroup auto group. So then we could reselect this outer mask, maybe do a little blur and sharpen, and then do that extraction. But I know that if I go back to this final extraction, what I can do is just grab this inner one. Let's do Control-Shift-P, which is my hotkey for the auto groups, which I know you can assign those on your own. But then I can now go in and just grab this guy and do the visibility grow all. So it'll grow out, because that's a separate shell. So as long as it's a separate shell, we can isolate it, hide it, and then go in here and just do delete hidden. So then now what you get is this. This is one of the reasons why I like this for the heel, is because the extraction is giving you something that you don't always get when you're dealing with other polygroups and things, which is or other features like panel loops and group loops, which is this inner group, that outer group, and then one for the edge, which can be beneficial to help tweak and fix these edges and things. So anytime you get a polygroup that meets another polygroup where you have that clean edge, the extrusion is just, or the extract is just doing one clean extrusion. So this is a clean edge loop. So if you go into this deformation polish by features, where that polygroup meets this edge and this polygroup meets this edge, this purple one, oh, it looks like we got a little random selection of colors. So I'm going to reassign those together. Oh wait, hold on, let's go back. Let's just grab these guys and see, are these being shared? That's its own group. And this, okay. So I want to do this outer one with these little artifact polygroups as one. And then this one with these guys. There we go. That should be now. So then now going to this polish by features, if we crank this thing up to 100, where those polygroup edges mean, it's going to smooth those things out a ton. So we've got this little circle here on the right side, which is currently closed, so it's off. So when this is, that setting is off, basically we're going to go in and it allows you to polish out those edges, but it doesn't shrink or change the mesh. It's just fixing those edges along that surface. But it doesn't have as strong of an effect. So if you click this thing open, like you see if I keep dragging it, you're kind of starting to see a little bit of effect here. But if you click this thing open and we crank this thing up, it's going to polish a lot faster. But you'll see the mesh is kind of slowly starting to shrink, which in this case I'm okay with because I can readjust it. But if you don't want to shrink the mesh for whatever reason, you can keep that open, but it's just going to take a lot of polishing and more finessing. So I like to open this up and just really hammer this slider here to tidy up those edges. So now we got this nice clean lip around it, and then we'll be able to make use of those polygroups later. So I'll depart from that for now. We'll leave that as is. Eventually we're going to start getting to the you know, getting the separate heel components and getting into do I have the bottom? Let me just do this real quick after a save and a drink of Wawa. And I guess I should check the chat. Pro 420 4210, they're funky shoes, but they're yesterday's tomorrow shoes. That's hilarious. Yeah, these things are awesome. They're stupid expensive though, right? Well, I think they were when they first came out, something like a couple $1,000. All right. So I was just gonna do just to show you quickly, the bottom gets a little crazy. Yeah, so we got a lot of complex stuff. So you got separate sort of transparent parts with sort of checkered diamond pattern, and then a separate sort of rubber part with texture on it. So we're going to have to start breaking this heel up into a lot more here in a second. So what I wanted to show you now is, which is extension, or it will apply for the heel as well, is starting to get to the paneling of the boot itself. So then now what I want to do is let's go in here And I want to go in here and I want to start assigning the polygroups of the panels of the shoe so we can start getting into doing these extrusions, which can be challenging, and I don't want to use the extract feature mainly because it's all, in reality, it's all one solid part. So easy thing that we can do is we could go in with the mask lasso here and we can start to just outline the edges of where this extrusion is going to go. Alright, so even although it's not a symmetrical piece, so now I'm going to go in with that mask pen and use this maybe lazy mouse to sort of tidy up this line. Let me just grab a quick reference for the back. Yeah, so this has got this more like maybe a little less lazy radius. Alright, now for this part, let's just grab a good front view real quick. So this panel here, it actually only comes out to about the front, and then it follows this sort of edge around the contour of this. So essentially what I'm going to want to do is I'm probably going to want to inverse this, but we don't want to assign this. Basically want to go in and start giving ourselves a cleaner selection of polygroups. So let me just, for reference, just so I don't do something different, I believe, yeah, I continue that all the way around, which should be okay. So I'm going to sharpen this guy, and then maybe the last little bit is just making sure this is nice and even. Alright, now I'll do Control W just to assign a group. Now this is the same color group, so let's give it something a little bit better. So I got this sort of blue group going. Now if I ever wanted to readjust this, I could always reselect it, mask it, and maybe tweak this just a little bit more to make this thicker on the inside. And then Control W again, so I'm going to make sure I don't have any sort of leftover artifact polygroups in there. So we could hide that one and that one. Let's just do, so you see these little leftover blue ones, so pressing Control W, now I got that thing working. So now going back into sort of the panel loop process, so we got this thing on the, we got this pink group here. So the pink group, I want to do just as, I want to separate the outer shell from the inner shell. So something that we can do is kind of go in, and I might just do a, let's see, how could we do this? Maybe go in with this selection lasso and just disconnect these parts that are currently touching. Alright, so now I've disconnected those inner and outer shells, so we can do Control Shift P, or Control P for me, which is my auto groups. So I'm just kind of using the polygroups to kind of grab a larger chunk. So I can grab this green group, mask that off. And then let's go in at that mask pen. So this part of the boot is going to be the sort of gray part. So it's going to transition under the heel. So you'll see that the mask is being protected by the former one. So what I might do is just turn solo off. I'm going to just go with the mask pen and just extend this down past the heel. So it's going to sit underneath a little bit better. And this one doesn't have to be too perfect. We could even go in with the mask lasso and just kind of do this all in one swoop. Now, just make sure that this blue group on the inside, I remember that this one, so I want to remove any masks from that inner part. So I'm using these poly groups to just deselect to hide and show. So I'm just getting this mask on the outer part, which you could do. You know, I'm kind of going to maybe just a little bit more of a technical way about doing it, but you could just go straight up with a mask pen and just start masking this thing along the edge if you'd like. Alright, so let's bump this last one up here. Alright. Now, I might spend a little bit more time just kind of tweaking those curves, but just for the sake of time. So now let's, oh, actually, but this is just no bueno. That's got to be a little bit tighter. Alright, now maybe sharpen this guy, and I'm just going to do Control W. So it's kind of, sometimes you'll get a group that's very similar to another color, but if I grab this guy and just do Control W to assign it a unique color group. So then now I've got that green one up here at the top, and then this one in here. So then just to maybe just make this a little bit easier, I could go in and let's just hide this guy, and let's group all this inner stuff together. Oh, looks like we got some stray groups. This guy. Get rid of the pink. Control Shift P. Yes, every once in a while you get these little random sort of polygroup islands, and that could just be from like mask lasso brush traveling through the mesh, that kind of stuff. So Control W. So I'm just assigning these polygroups so that way I can grab, okay, this is the mask for that outer part, this is the mask for that top part of the boot, and I can grab the heel if I want to, and the inner. So I got this stuff more easily accessible. So now getting into that panel loop stuff, let's see here. Can we go? Sometimes Dynamesh will, yeah, Dynamesh will keep those polygroups. So I just remeshed it down a little bit lower with these groups. And then what we could do now is we could start to do our paneling of all these separate components. So going into the geometry, edge loop, menu, we've got our group loops and we've got our panel loops. So the panel loops, what it's going to do is if I just click this button, it's going to take those polygroups and it's going to go through and apply all these settings and configurations to the mesh. Now, just to kind of walk through this if you aren't familiar with this feature, number one, the thickness is going to define the level of extrusion. So if we undo this, let's say we make this like 0.04, and then click panel loops, you'll see you're going to get a wider sort of extrusion. And you'll see that the edge of this thing itself, it's got a bevel on it. So that bevel, if you go down just below the, you got bevel and elevation, click this little curve menu open, and we've got just a basic stair step bevel. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 points along this sort of curve. So if we go in and just grab this polygroup and grow this thing out, you'll see that that edge is going to reflect exactly what we have in here. So you can actually control how this edge works if we go back, just undo beforehand, and let's just say we like, let's copy this as a backup. So you can copy, you can save these things if you want to. So we can go in and save something I'll do with my projects is like make a folder and call this like bevel profile curves. We just call that default. So maybe you wanted to go in and just add a couple extra points, maybe make this thing stair step a little bit here. And then if we go in and click panel loops, now if we grab this thing and grow it out, you're going to get that sort of profile curve. So it can help to make some really interesting sort of extrusions and edges. Now, going back to this, let's say we undo to before we did that panel loop again, and we do, if we click reset, reset's going to get rid of all those points, and it's going to give you just a flat sort of extrusion. So clicking panel loops in this case is just basically going to go through, and that thickness, you'll see it's pushing it out. So we might want to keep that that default setup. So let's just go into load, so I can load that Z curve, and then we could run that panel loops. Now before I do that, I just want to mention what helps drive all this. At the top you've got a number of loops. So this is the number of edge loops. So you'll see here it's set to 5. So if I grow this thing out one more time, you've essentially got, in order to capture that extrusion, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 edges. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 edges to maintain that that level of extrusion. So if you undo this and don't have the correct number, you're basically not gonna, like say you set this loop to 1 and you panel loop it, it's not able to achieve that. It's just doing one straight extrusion. So the default setup's pretty good as far as the number of loops, but then this gets into the next portion, which is the kinds of shelling you want to do, and you'll see that the double option is turned on. So when I leave this option on and we click panel loops, if we say grow this thing out to the entire shell, what it does is it makes a complete closed shell of each of those major polygroups, which in this case we want to actually sort of compound these together and add on top of and keep it all connected. So if I undo this one more time and let's just go turn off that double option and let's do panel loops again, it's going to do the same thing, but what's going to happen is if I grab this group and I grow this thing out, I'm just doing Control-Shift-X, you'll see that as it gets around the inside, it goes back and it connects those edges. So essentially as I keep growing, it's growing to the entire shell. So in this stage, this is what we want to do, is we don't want to use the double option, or rather, in my scenario, I don't want to use the double option because I want to be able to compound these on top. If you do want to do a separate sort of shell, separate sort of groups and objects, then the double option might be what you need. But for now, I'm going to keep this off so that way I can make this all connected. And you'll see that now I'm starting to get that sort of lip around the edge of that shoe. We got that nice sort of extrusion, but the sort of the edge control, you'll see is still a little wonky. So when you run this panel loops, it also has a polish setting. So the polish by default we have set to 5, which I honestly cannot remember if, I believe it's 50 in other scenarios. Like the group's polish is at 50. Maybe this is my preference in this project, but either way, we can undo this one more time and crank up this polish to say 50. So what it's going to do is apply the same settings, but run a bit of a polish on it to smooth out those edges and make this thing just a little bit cleaner. Now, that's an automatic thing when you generate it. If you don't do that polish, like say we go back, we set that thing back to 5, and then we panel loops, it's just going to give you some wonky edges. But because the panel loops feature, what it does is it's assigning, as we were kind of discussing with the heel, a clean polygrip at each of these border edges, which makes it really easy to go to deformation and do this polish by features. So you could use the polish by features with this close, so it doesn't do any shrinking, and try and polish this as much as you can. But it's still, you get a little wonky edges. If you open this up and then go in and polish, it's going to start to smooth this out quite a bit, which I prefer in this case. Now, the little bit of shrinking and all that stuff that's kind of happening, that is going to affect, if you go into the floor grid, it is going to, like if I keep shrinking, you'll see the mesh is going to start losing its relationship with the orthographic reference. So there's really something that's kind of like a push and pull for me. I don't mind. I'm really more concerned about the cleanliness of the edges, and now I can just kind of go back and start to readjust these sort of curves and start lining these things back up. So I'm just looking at the edges here for now. Not too concerned with see this outer portion, this little sort of puffy part. I've got a poly group for that now, so I can grab this thing, mask it off, and even just blur it a little bit away from that edge, and then inverse. And now we could go in and I can start to, say, puff this out and make it a lot bigger and more accurate to that reference. So then now going back to this, so now we got this thing rocking, and then I've got my heel. So I did some of that polishing was a little wonky as far as the sort of it's like protruding through the heel. So we could go in, grab this group, grow this thing up to. In reality, we might not even need this whole bottom portion here, so we could actually go into this part right here, reverse this, and we've got this. Even get rid of this little green group. So that's just a sort of hollowed out inner piece here. And I could go into Geo, modify topology, and do that delete hidden. Whoops. Delete hidden. And maybe just kind of go in and just push this in. Alright, so now I'm getting some of these like higher levels of detail going. Now moving on to some extra stuff, like if you look at one of the things I love about this technique with panel loops is this portion here is a little bit extruded. Like when you got it's bumping out one step further. So actually kind of going in here, we've got part of this working, but now we can actually stack these panel loops on top of each other, which it almost gets infinite, which I'll try to show off with the heel, some more complex shapes and more abstract shapes as well. But grabbing this outer blue group now, what you can do with panel loops is when I ran the first operation, I did it with everything visible. But if you select a particular polygroup and hide the other parts, we can run the same operation only on this portion. So keeping that same thickness, I don't want to do double side, I just want to bump it out. And then let's take a look at the bevel profile. I might want to change, but let's just run this and go take a look. So now it's doing that nice bevel profile around that edge, and it's sort of giving you a nice sort of detailed panel. So we could go in and maybe undo that, change the thickness a little bit lower, say like 0.02. So it's not as large of a step to do that sort of extrusion. But now, and then if we go in here and we just apply a little smoothing, you'll see that you got a nice soft rounded edge with that bevel shape. Now if you don't want to do that profile, you could always reset and do just a flat extrusion. So it's just going to extrude that thing straight out. So instead of doing any level of detail, or you can angle it or change it, play around with that profile curve to get some really cool sort of contours and shapes for that. Just little minutia details, you know, but that stuff, depending on what you're making, that could be make or break for what you're trying to achieve and the kinds of detail you're going for. So I find that to be really, really beneficial. And then let's see, what do we got going here? So I would bet that if we go to the floor grid, we could probably just grab this heel. I think this is like gonna have to be just a little bit bigger. So now I kind of go through and I'm just kind of adjusting the sort of distance that this heel is from the outer part, and then even just maybe going in and hiding this part so I can see from the top view. I'm gonna bring this back. All right, cool. So then, you know, this stuff getting into the sort of inner portion here, that's something we could do towards the end. We could do a live boolean on top of that. So I want to hammer this this sort of workflow here a little bit more, since we got about 30 more minutes before I gotta cut it off. But let me check the chat real quick, make sure I'm not missing anything. Jacob's tuning in. How's it going, buddy? Thanks, buddy. I really appreciate it. It's this is the second time through running through this shoe, actually. Art Temple, if you were asked to model something like that for a company, how long should you tell them it would take to model? That's a good question, Art. I would guesstimate around a couple weeks. I'd give yourself a week or two to finesse it. I mean, it would really depend on the complexity of the shoe. Like this, I would say, if you're looking at the primary shapes for all this, these are pretty basic shapes to sort of hit and capture. Although, like, there's some of these other things took me a little bit more time the first time around. But like getting into, if you're doing a shoe like this guy, for example, or see if I can go back to like a more complex running shoe where you got a lot of stitching and a lot of patterns. This stuff I find to be much more challenging, because like even just looking at this heel, for example, like you see like just the contour of these shapes and things, this stuff takes a little bit of finessing to get working properly with this method. So I'd say I'd give yourself a ballpark of around 2 weeks or so to finalize. And that might, and depending on, I don't know about texturing and sort of look dev or shaders or anything like that, but just the construction and the model itself, at least a week or two, if that helps. Matthias, how do you do the text Nike logo? No, I haven't addressed that. That's a good question. The logo itself, I guess you're probably referring to like this. We got this portion here, so I got this logo. This is just a simple extract. This stuff is also an extraction, but it's sort of a I use the extractions to sort of build on top of. So I guess real quick, I could start hitting on that portion there. So going into my ortho, like we got this sort of rubber panel. So the text is form fit to that rubber panel. So I need that first for that to work. I could do the Nike logo. I could do that now. We could just go into the floor grid and let's just grab the boot panel. So before I always recommend before you do all this, like before you start getting into these last little bits, you want to make sure that the shell shapes that you're starting from are exactly where you want them to be. Because once you start, like I'm going to go through and do this, and if you start these things too early and you go through and say you like change the angle of this boot, like say you put, I don't know why you do that, but say you change it in a way, in any way, shape, or form, all those other components are now going to be misaligned. So I would say make sure that this stuff is lined up before you get to that point. But then going into the floor grid, I could just go in with the mask pen here. Whoops, I need the mask lasso. Oh gosh, that's just beautiful. Sorry, my screen's getting a little sticky, so I need a glove. Oh, I turned on dynamic, that's why. So we could just kind of go in and rough out this edge here. Lazy mouse is key for these kinds of cleanups, especially for that Nike swoosh, which is very specific. And then let's go to this side here. So because this is an extraction, it may not require as clean of a mask or a surface to get this mask resolution from. Like, see how this is pretty low res, but I would bet that I can do a pretty decent job or get a pretty decent mesh out of this. Alright, that's a little messy, but hey, let's call it. So we'll go subtool, going back to that extract, and boom. So I got a decent selection in there. It's not the best. So here's something I might do just as a proxy. Like, I don't want to mess with this boot's resolution, but I can make a duplicate of this guy. Let's solo this out, and I'll just do a Control W to assign, just to keep that mask so I can save myself the work. And we could go into Geo and add a subdivision. So jump this up in resolution. Even if you want to go further, get it up to into 1,000,000. And then now we can grab this mask again, and let's just do a little blur. And now I could just kind of go in and tidy up this selection here. So you get more for your buck if you increase that resolution, so you get a cleaner isolation of that shape. Alright, so it's not like perfect. Let's just call that. So then now going into subtool at a higher resolution, if we extract that thing, it's going to get, it's basically using the source mesh topology. So then maybe I'm going to go down to say 0.01, a little bit less thickness, click accept. Now you get this. So that thing traveled through. I'm just going to grab that whole shell, go to Geo, modify topo, delete hidden. So then with the extraction, again, you're getting that those polygroups. So we could go in and just reassign this panel here. It's adding these extra little wonky groups in there. So then now you could go to your deformation, polish by features, and we can run this polish here, and then click that open to really hammer that logo. So the polish by features, with the shrinking, it's going to actually shrink around the edges, but I guess a little pro tip for you guys, when you want to, like the Nike logo, it's more of a point, so I don't want that. I basically don't want that polish to, it's rounding this piece out, if that makes sense. So I don't want this to round out, and what I could do is we could go into this, we got double-sided on, so grab this guy. If we just disconnect, let's just go grab a mask lasso at the point here, so disconnect those edges anywhere along this mesh. So let's just say we do it like somewhere back. So where else would those be connecting? Oh, so I need to do it over here as well. So say like here. So now I'm removing that edge and I'm just doing that polygroup auto group option. So it's giving a unique group here and a unique group here. So I just want to assign this little new group with making sure that that's with the one of these. So you get one meeting another. So now when you've got one polygroup meeting an edge on this area, if you go to deformation and run this polish, it's actually going to start to make a hard point in that area. So that can kind of help you to kind of go through, polish by features if you don't want that thing to round out too much. And then we could even just go in and kind of just like tweak it with the move brush if you wanted to. So this is how I do a lot of these sort of extra layers of components. Like some things you don't need to do panel loops with. You know, like you could use this as a starter for this, and then kind of going back to that ortho, like I got this extra panel now. So going back to the boot, I don't need the duplicate now. So I just use that duplicate to add some extra res. And now let's just go in and just do the, so we got this guy with this guy. So I'm just doing a simple little selection. right? And then just doing an extract, accept, making sure I don't have any double groups in there, which I got to remedy that. But let's go delete hidden. So now just taking this component, like this took a little bit more finessing. So number one, going into that polish by features now, cleaning this piece up, but then using that outer group to mask this thing off. And then I actually went into deformation and just did a little bit of inflate. And then maybe do a little polish by features, and you're starting to basically hit this thing home. And then you got the reference here to just maybe just go in if you really need to start sort of fixing the sort of contour of this shape here. It's not quite going up. It's like almost touching the back. So this is how I did this piece. So once you get this guy, I can go over to that. Oh, let's go to the final. So I ended up with like a nice clean piece, which I haven't been able to get to, like doing these little bits of details. But once you got this stuff lined up, I basically, what I did is I found a good reference image here with Spotlight. I was working on, this is the left foot. Turn this opacity down. So this is kind of just like eyeballing it. But you're taking this piece here and then going in with the mask brush. And I'm just actually gonna, because it's such a unique like sort of shape with the fonts and everything, I found this particular type of text was a lot easier to do it, also because it's form fit on the surface. So going in with that mask brush, oops, let's do, I just lost my reference. And I kind of like this method too. Like, I don't know, I find it to be more fun to do handwork stuff like this. I think that's why I sort of gravitated towards this shoe, because it's very unique. It's not very like, it's got a lot of cool organic shapes. It doesn't feel like a surgically, constructed shoe, by a machine. It's like, it feels very handworked. So then just kind of roughing out the text and then going into that subtool, extract. I think I'm going to put this to like 0.02 again, and then click accept. So that's got some texture. I had surface noise on that one. The original doesn't have any of that surface texture, but then you get this really nice text in here that just going in, even just running a little polish by features will kind of help to clean that up. So that's how I did the air mag text. It was pretty much that, just stacking those on top. But so hopefully that answers your question. If you're still there, that was for Matthias. Or no, sorry. Yeah, it was Matthias. All right. So then, so we're running out of time here. I got 10 more minutes. All right. Well, man, I was really hoping to get to I wanted to try and get to this stuff. So once we start to getting into the heel, I'll show you the construction of the heel. This is all a lot of surface noise, like I mentioned at the beginning of the stream. But getting the extractions and the shapes is priority number one. So going into the heel, basically just taking a look at that floor grid, and now we got to go through this same process. So going in with the mask lasso, starting to isolate out these shapes, and these are also different on the inside compared to the outside. So if we grab this guy, you got this loop in here. I think this one shows it off better. And then it sort of disconnects and goes underneath. And you can really tell with this shape here. So what I ended up doing was, again, just using Spotlight here to rotate, flip this thing. So lining this up roughly into place, and then let's just go in. I could use the mask circle here. To kind of ballpark that one. And maybe use the mask pen with lasso or with lazy mouse. So then I can kind of get an idea of what parts I need to assign this polygroup for. So then this reference image here kind of shows this thing loops around, comes underneath, and then reconnects. So it's kind of going like somewhere around here to here. Alright, now let's see, well, to wrap this thing up here, so I got this mask on the bottom portion, which is fine, but all these inner parts, I want to just quickly just grab this guy. And just a quick tip if you guys aren't familiar with this, if you just control drag to clear the mask, that clears the mask for everything. So in this case, when you're isolating an area, I got to make sure I go in here, deselect with the control and alt to deselect that part of the mask to remove it from that part. So then now I can go in here and I can assign this a group. So I got a unique polygroup for this guy. So then taking just this chunk here, I could go in and let's just solo this out. I could go in here and just grab this polygroup, go back into those panel loop features. And so I'm just hiding this group, and I could go in and let's just grab this thickness, let's say 0.02. We could panel loop this. Now this is currently set to double, so what I want to do first is I might want to, let's just reevaluate this these polygroups. So those guys are together. Actually, what I want to do is this one with maybe this guy. So that one's in its own sort of group. So then we got an inner group here just in case. But if we just go and turn off double and just do a panel loop for all these shells, this heel is basically just these sort of separate components again. So now I could take this and go in and do my deformation, polish by features. But in that case, it didn't quite hold up for the inner group. So let's just maybe grab this guy as one. So we'll just do two. So go into that geo, hit those panel loops. Now if you want to undo that, I might just add an extra polish in here and run it. So I get some polish, and then we could go do deformation, polish by features. And then like this would be enough, like this is at least giving me the separate shells, and then I'm going to go through and do surface noise patterns on top. But some ideas just to give you an idea of like where the sort of abstract ways that you could take this would be thinking about additional layers and stacking these panel loops on. So before I talked about the sort of stair stepping of the boot, but let's say you wanted to do some inner ones and get into some more crazy shapes. So when you got these panel loop polygroups assigned from these panel loops, we could say grab this group, mask it off. We could go into our masking palette and maybe just do a little shrink and sharpen, shrink. So I'm using the polygroups to kind of drive the clean selection and shrink it, and then let's say we make this a polygroup, and let's go grab this one now. And we could maybe take this going into geo, and as I mentioned, let's instead of doing an outer one, we could do an inner one. So going into the inner option, clicking this option is going to keep the same sort of stepping of thickness, but it's going to push it inside the mesh. So clicking this and running this is going to push it downwards, which if I wanted to, I could make this like, let's do like 0.04, go a little bit further in. And then we could go now into that deformation, maybe do a little polish by features, just to kind of keep cleaning that up. And then, you know, continue to build on top. Like if you wanted to grab these guys, mask those off to get a selection, and let's just do a little shrink and sharpen to give it a little border. Whoops. I'm only going to be able to go so far. Control W. And then instead of doing inner, let's do outer. Right, so now you get this little outer sort of extrusion inside of there. And you could stack this on top and keep making all kinds of crazy shapes, and it really, it really only comes down to one thing, which is the assigning of the shape with the mask. And then once you get that, you can assign a quick and clean polygroup, and you can start to make all kinds of crazy interesting shapes in this way. And then just imagine, you know, if you get into, you know, kind of going down this road where you start then adding additional little shapes. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to talk about this, but a lot of this is insert mesh brushes, just, you know, creating more abstract little objects and shapes if you're going down that road. But I find this to be a really powerful tool just to create, especially in the Nike world. You know, if you're familiar with like Air Jordans and some of the more crazy shapes on the bottom of the soles, they always have these really like fluid lines and shapes and things that are really, really awesome. And you could even, you know, continue to grab, like, say we go in here and we just want to do like a little sort of like couple circle shapes in here. Maybe match this one up. Group those guys. We could go in and do, you know, just a panel loop a little bit thicker and start to make some more interesting shapes outside of that just by driving from the mask itself, or get crazy with it. So yeah, so that's about all the time I have. So I want to quickly just run in the chat the last couple minutes. Meyer Mayo. Oh, I can't even say your name. Meyer Mayolo. Hopefully I said that right. I don't know if you're talking to me or somebody else. Judging from those shoes, I bet you're doing Miles Morales. I don't know what that is. Should I Google that? Yeah, maybe I missed something up in the chat. Going back to the Bob, I'm Kid123. You were asking if I'd be doing the whole boot today. Well, that's about as far as I got. But the next stream, I would actually like to continue building on top of this and get into sort of finalizing this, especially with the surfacing of the heel. That's what I find is really interesting, and like getting into just like going back to the shoe itself. Setting this up for like inner parts to start setting up glows, doing lights on the inside of this part, getting the sort of patterns and the fabric and weave. A lot of this stuff gets just getting into like surface noise and that kind of stuff. But so definitely my next stream, I'd be happy to plan on doing this again if you're interested. But if you guys don't have any more questions, it looks like we're good. Art Temple, yeah, it's my pleasure, man. Anytime. I appreciate all you guys tuning in, and I will try my best to be doing this, get back to once a month. So shoot us a message, send us some feedback if you guys like this stream, or if you guys want to hear more stuff, let me know. My next stream, Jake, isn't officially scheduled, but what are we doing? We're mid-January. I would probably say early February. I gotta work it out with the schedule with the guys and set it up, but I'll definitely be back soon, I promise. Yeah, thanks, Dry Otter. Appreciate it. It's my pleasure. And you guys have a good rest of your week, and I'll see you next time.